everyone. Thank you for tuning in as we continue with our study of the book of John. I hope that you're gaining as much as I am from this study, if not more. This morning, I read John chapter 6 and want to be able to use this time to share with you a few thoughts that came to mind for me as I read that chapter. We see very early on here, Jesus performed an incredible miracle. He took 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish, and after giving thanks, he increased the amount they had there to an amount that ended up feeding over 5,000 people. Whenever I read this, I always wonder what it would have been like to just be there and see this miracle take place. I'm sure it was amazing for those who were there. As I was reading this morning, one of the first things that caught my eyes is found in verse 6, where we see Jesus intentionally putting his disciples in a situation to test them. And I couldn't help but think about how God does the same thing with us in our relationship with him. He puts us in situations to test us so that the truth of who we are or who we're being can surface. And that way we can have the truth to be able to make decisions, real decisions about our lives. And the other thing that caught my eyes was in verse 14 and 15. We see how those who were around Jesus as he performed this miracle, because they benefited from it, they ended up eating bread and fish. They were very willing to put their faith in Jesus. They were willing to believe that he was who he said he was. And I think about how easy it is for me to put my trust in God when things are happening in a way that I understand or happening in a way that is favorable to my situation. In those moments, it's not a challenge for me. Things are going well. I can trust God. I'm not questioning him. I'm not wondering what he's doing. I'm trying to figure out, what does he want me to do? It's very easy when things are going well. And those two instances in the chapter really provided a theme for me as I read through and just saw how Jesus was interacting with the crowd there. We see that, it's very obvious that these people were consumed with the thought that they will get physical food if they stick around Jesus. And Jesus knew that. In verse 26, I love what it says. Jesus says, "Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." So he understood what they were thinking, and he used what they were thinking to teach them that he was the bread of life, and that only those who ate his flesh and drank his blood would have eternal life. Now, he was, of course, using an analogy or a parable, if you will, to make a spiritual point. But many of the people following him did not understand what he meant. Some of them were even offended by what he was saying. And here's the thing I think that's extremely interesting and very thought-provoking for me is we know that according to verse 64, Jesus knew exactly what they were thinking. But he never stopped and to clarify what he was saying. In other words, he didn't say, "I don't mean actually eating my flesh and drinking my blood, y'all. What I'm saying is you have to be consumed with being with me and knowing me." He never stopped and said that. He literally just left it out there, knowing what people were thinking. And I believe as you read through this chapter, what I realize is that Jesus really wanted to leave it out there to find out who was really interested in being with him. And of course, we see in verse, I believe it was 66 here, that many people stopped following him after that time. It says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. As I said earlier, when I'm not clear about what God is doing or when what he's doing seems not to be favorable to my situation, it's harder for me to follow him. But when I think about trusting God, it's always about sticking around to learn God's truth especially in the moments when I don't understand what God's doing. You know, in a couple more chapters, we'll read John chapter 8, and I love what it says in verse 31, 32. You know, Jesus talking to a group of Jews who believed in him, he said, if you hold to my teachings, then you will know the truth, and then the truth will set you free. So obviously, there are points in our walk with God where we won't fully know what God is doing, but we're still called to stick around, to obey him and follow him. And this is really what the thought that there are a couple of questions I asked myself as I read this morning. The first one is, are you sticking around? And of course, you know, some of you are thinking, Pierre, you know, that's a stupid question. We're sequestered in our homes. Of course, we're sticking around. But that's not what I mean. I mean, spiritually, are you sticking around in your relationship with God when things are not very clear for you as to what's happening around you? You know, at this time, one of the thoughts that I've been thinking a lot about is that, you know, sin and Satan are really, they're our real spiritual enemy. You know, the coronavirus is an infection. That's not our spiritual enemy. But sin and Satan, they're the enemy. And the second question I've asked myself in light of that thought is, you know, am I deserting my relationship with God for the temporary pleasures of sin, whatever the sin is? And I do believe that's a question, you know, during this time where we continue to be at home and maybe not be out and about as we normally are, we need to ask ourselves, are we willing to abandon or desert our relationship with God when it's not very clear what's happening because we want to experience the temporary pleasures of sin? You know, after many of the people abandoned Jesus in John chapter 6, you know, he turned to the 12 and he asked them, you do not want to leave too, do you? And I do believe Jesus was sharing this, you know, not in a cold way, but I do believe that he understood the ramification of the decision that the people who deserted them were making. He understood that. He understood how that was not good for them. And so there's no way he was asking that question in a cold, calculated way. I do believe Jesus was saddened by that and disappointed even. And I think in turning to the 12, you know, he was asking that question in a very real way. And I love what we find in verses 68 and 69. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. And for me, as I read that, what I hear Peter saying is, look, I'm sticking around. I want to be with you. I want to learn from you. So my encouragement this morning is let's stick around in our relationship with God. It's the only way to learn the truth about things that are not so clear to us now. And one of the practical ways we can continue to stick around is by continuing to fix our eyes on Jesus through our study of John. So let's stay committed to that and to continue to do that.